A window lit up. Tobias was already awake. He'd been awake for an hour, lying on his back in the dark, listening to the house do nothing. No sounds. No one turning over in the other bed. No one breathing beside him. Just the night, thick as felt, pressing against the walls. He'd learned to sleep through it. He hadn't learned to stop noticing it. He sat up when he caught the movement. Two shapes at the tree line, where his east field rolled up to meet the forest edge. They moved low and careful, crossing the cut rows, not hiding exactly, but not announcing themselves either. They were moving through his land the way you move through a place you know doesn't belong to you, and you're not asking it to. He pulled on his boots without lacing them, took the rifle from behind the door, and went out. The air hit him first. Dry wheat smell and cold grass, that particular mix of late summer mornings before the sun reaches anything. He crossed the yard in the gray dark. The two shapes had stopped at the field's edge, not 50 steps from him. They didn't run. One of them turned and stood straight. She was tall for a woman, slender but built with purpose, dark green skin catching what little light the pre-dawn gave. Her hair, dark red, braided tight, had bone pins along the plaits. She carried a small axe at her hip and a leather harness across her shoulders that had seen real use. On her right forearm, 7 horizontal lines in black ink ran from wrist toward elbow. She looked at the rifle, and she didn't flinch. "We are passing through," she said. Behind her, the second one was younger, softer in the face, same dark red hair worn loose. She had 3 small dots tattooed on her left cheek. She was watching him the way you watch a man who's already made his decision before he knows it. Tobias looked at them. Then he looked at his field. 2/3 harvested, the rest standing. He'd been at it alone for 11 days, and his back had something to say about every one of them. The far rows hadn't been touched. He'd been trying not to count how many days it would take him alone. The number wasn't good. He lowered the rifle. He didn't put it away, just held it loose at his side. "Are you hungry?" he said. The older one said nothing for a beat. She looked at him the way people look at a door they don't quite trust, like it might close on them before they get through. "We didn't ask for food," she said. "I know," Tobias said. "I'm asking anyway." He turned and walked back to the house. He left the door open. He didn't look back to see if they followed. He set the rifle against the wall inside, built the fire up from the coals, and put the pot of last night's porridge on the grate. He heard boots on the porch steps. One set, then a pause, then a second set. He didn't comment on the pause. The two of them stood inside his door and looked at the room. It was a large kitchen for one man, that was obvious. A table built for 6, 4 chairs around it and 2 more pushed against the wall. Dried herbs in bundles along the ceiling beam. A woman's apron still hung on its hook beside the hearth, faded red with a small tear along the hem that had never been mended. Tobias stirred the porridge and didn't explain any of it. The younger one, the one with the loose hair, sat down first, pulling a chair slightly away from the table before she settled into it, like she was used to leaving herself an exit. The older one stayed standing until the younger one was seated. Then she chose the chair with the wall behind it. She set the small axe on her knee under the table. Tobias saw her do it and said nothing. He ladled out 3 bowls, set them down, sat across from them, and ate. Nobody talked. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift from black to the color of old iron. The older one ate steadily, watching the room. Her eyes moved to the apron, to the 2 empty chairs pushed against the wall, to the line of 4 cups on the shelf, one of them slightly different from the others, newer glaze, given to him by his younger son 2 winters before he left for the city. She was counting, Tobias thought. She was reading the room the way a soldier reads a campsite, taking inventory of who was missing. The younger one ate faster and then sat back with her hands wrapped around the bowl. She was looking at the bundles of herbs on the beam, studying them the way you study something you recognize. Tobias caught the look. "My wife grew them," he said. He didn't elaborate. The older one set down her spoon. She looked at him with those sharp, golden-brown eyes, and whatever she was thinking, she kept behind them. The younger one made a small sound, something that might have been the beginning of a word, then didn't finish it. The older one looked at her sister, and that was enough. The sound stopped. They finished eating. The fire cracked. Outside, the field stood in the dawn, 2/3 done, waiting. Some things don't need to be decided out loud. A man lowering a rifle is a whole conversation, if you know how to listen. "I can pay," Tobias said. He'd cleared the bowls. The older one, she hadn't given her name yet, was sitting with her arms crossed, watching him the way she'd been watching him since the yard, like she was waiting for the part where this stopped making sense. The younger one had her hands flat on the table and was looking out the window at the field. Tobias poured himself a second cup of water and stood at the counter. "The harvest. I need hands. I can pay in coin or in food, your choice. The work is straightforward. Cut, bind, stack. I won't pretend it's light work." He looked at the older one when he said the last part, not as a challenge, as a fact. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her sister. The sister was still watching the field, the way a person watches something they already understand without being told. The rows, the angle of the standing grain, what the soil looked like where it was cut versus where it wasn't. The younger one said something in a language Tobias didn't know, low and short, 2 or 3 words. The older one's jaw tightened. She looked back at Tobias. "What is the rate?" she said. Not a question exactly. A negotiation opening. 2 silvers a day each, or the equivalent in grain and dried goods. You eat at the table. You sleep on the property if you want a roof. He said it flat, the same way he'd have said it to any hired man from the village. Same words, same tone. The older one heard that. He could see it register somewhere behind her eyes, that absence of hedging. She looked at him for another beat. 3 days, she said. "We assess at the end of 3 days." "Fair," Tobias said. He got the sickles down from the barn wall himself. 3 of them, because there were 3 of them, even if he hadn't thought it through that far when he reached up. He handed one to the younger one first, because she was already walking toward the field. She took it without looking at the handle, just weighed it in her grip and adjusted her fingers once. She knew a sickle. The older one took hers and looked at the blade. She ran her thumb along the edge, not testing it for sharpness, just acquainting herself with it, the way you'd learn a new knife before you trusted it with anything important. Tobias went in at the near row. He worked the way he'd worked for 20 years. Rhythm, angle. Don't fight the grain. Within a few minutes, he heard the younger one start, somewhere in the middle section. Her stroke was low and clean. She cut from the base, and she was fast about it, not rushed, but efficient, like someone who'd done the same motion 1,000 times and stopped thinking about it. He glanced over once. Her skirt was tucked up into her waistband, and she moved through the row without slowing. The older one started at the far end. Tobias worked without looking up for a long stretch. He was aware of them the way you're aware of the shape of a room in the dark. Not watching, just knowing where they were. The grain was dry and good this year. It fell right if you caught it at the correct angle. He heard both of them settle into their rhythms, different from each other. The younger one lighter and quicker, the older one slower, but her strokes carrying more weight behind them. He found himself listening to the 2-rhythm sound of it, and it was not an unpleasant sound. By mid-morning, they'd taken half the remaining field. Tobias straightened up and looked along the rows. He did the arithmetic, and then he stood there a moment with the arithmetic in his head. His sons had worked this land growing up, both of them healthy boys, and they'd complained about the sickle work, and they'd found reasons to stop, and they'd done adequate work when pushed. He wasn't comparing them unfairly. He just knew the numbers. What a day on this field looked like, how much ground got covered. And he was looking at the results of a morning. The younger one came up beside him to move to the next row, and she caught his expression. "The soil here's dry, but it holds," she said. "Good depth." She said it the way you'd say it to someone who already knew, and you were just confirming. Not showing off, just talking about the land. "Been farming it for 16 years, Tobias said. "It shows," she said, and moved on. The older one worked with her head down and didn't talk. But when the younger one said something, when she pointed out where the grain had gone slightly thin at the east edge, when she noted the angle of the hill and how the water would run in autumn, the older one slowed her stroke just slightly, and her head tilted. Just a fraction. She was listening. She was doing it in exactly the way a person listens when they've decided they're not going to show that they're interested. They broke at noon. Tobias brought water and hard bread and the heel of a cured sausage he'd been saving for nothing in particular. They sat at the field's edge in the thin shade of the boundary stones. The younger one ate and looked at the sky. The older one looked at the remaining work. "We can finish the main section by evening," she said. "I wasn't expecting to finish in 3 days total," Tobias said honestly. She didn't respond. She drank her water, handed the cup back, and stood up. She went back to the field before he'd finished eating. He watched her work for a moment. She moved through the grain with that same measured economy. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. The axe at her hip didn't shift or interfere. The battle tattoos on her forearm caught the light each time her arm came through the stroke. 7 lines. He didn't know what they counted in her culture, and he didn't ask. He went back to his own row. The afternoon wore on, hot and still. Somewhere around the 3rd hour of it, Tobias became aware that he'd stopped thinking about the work and had just been doing it. The 3 of them moving in their separate rhythms through the standing grain, the cut rows growing behind them. That particular kind of quiet, the productive kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. He hadn't had that in a long time. He'd had it once, with Magda, with the boys when they were still young enough to work without resentment. It was a specific texture of quiet. He hadn't expected to find it here. Some silences are empty, and some silences are the sound of more than one person deciding not to leave. The sky turned the color of old copper an hour before dark. Tobias leaned his sickle against the boundary stone and looked at what they'd done. The main section was gone, cut clean, the rows lying flat and bound, the stacked sheaves standing in lines down the length of the field. He'd stopped counting at some point and just worked, and now he was looking at the result, and it was more than he'd hoped for when he woke up this morning with a rifle in his hand. The younger one, Riska, the older one had used her name once in the afternoon, a short correction when Riska had moved to the wrong row, was at the far end, finishing the last of the binding. She tied the twine with a particular knot, a flat double wrap that Tobias hadn't seen before. It would hold. You could see that just by looking at it. The older one was cleaning her sickle blade with a scrap of cloth she'd produced from somewhere in her harness. She cleaned it the way you cleaned a weapon. Not obsessive, just thorough, without that being strange. "There's a barn," Tobias said. He kept his voice even, like the offer was nothing. "Try. There's a cot in the back room and straw enough in the loft. Warmer than open ground tonight." The older one folded the cloth and looked at him. "We'll find our own camp," she said. "Suit yourself," he said, and meant it. He walked back to the house. He got the fire going and put water on for washing. He heard Riska finish in the field, the sound of her footsteps through the cut rows, her and the older one talking low between themselves at the field's edge. He didn't try to hear it. He washed his face and hands and neck and stood at the window looking out of the yard. Two figures over by the tree line. The older one had her arms crossed and was looking at the sky. Riska was looking at the barn. The first drop hit the window glass 10 minutes later. By the time it started in earnest, it was coming down at an angle, the way it does when the wind catches it, driving under eaves and into any gap it can find. Tobias built the fire up higher. He heard the barn door. He didn't go out. He gave them the not being watched while they made the decision. After a while, he heard them settle, the loft boards flexing under weight, the small sounds of two people arranging themselves in an unfamiliar space. He put out his lamp and went to bed. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet soil and something green underneath it. That particular smell that means the land is still alive under the dry season's surface. Tobias went out at first light to check the sheaves. Rain on fresh-cut grain was bad news if you hadn't stacked it right, but they'd stacked it right. He walked the rows, and the stacks were solid. He was coming back around the side of the barn when he saw it. The corner of the barn roof, the northeast corner where the old boards had been pulling away from the beam for 2 seasons. He'd been meaning to fix it. He'd said that sentence to himself 100 times over 100 mornings. He'd even put the nails in his pocket once and gotten distracted by something else. The gap had widened over the winter until you could see sky through it if you stood inside and looked up. It was closed. Not patched with whatever was at hand, not roughly nailed. Closed properly. Someone had reseated the board, braced it from underneath with a piece of timber that hadn't been there yesterday, and nailed the whole thing through from the outside in at least 4 places. The nails were his own, from the tin on the workbench inside the barn. The tin that had been sitting there since last autumn. Whoever had done it had found the tin in the dark, found the hammer beside it, and done the work before dawn. He stood there and looked at it. He looked at the neat line of nail heads along the board. He looked at the brace below. He looked at the way the repair met the existing structure, not fighting it, working with the angle of the original timber. Whoever had done this had looked at the problem first and understood it before reaching for a nail. The barn door was open. He could hear Riska inside moving toward the door. He turned and walked back to the house before she came out. He didn't want her to catch him standing there. He wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. The same way you don't look directly at something that might disappear if you acknowledge it too plainly. He put the porridge on. By the time they came in from the yard, he had 3 bowls on the table and the fire going, and he didn't say a word about the roof. The older one, she'd told him her name in the afternoon when Riska used it, but she hadn't offered it directly. Hassa. He used it once in his head and set it down. She sat in the same chair as yesterday, back to the wall. She'd washed her face. The bone pins in her plates were the same ones. She ate and looked at the window. Riska ate quickly and then sat with her hands around the bowl, looking at the bundles of herbs on the ceiling beam again. She'd been looking at those herbs since yesterday morning. Today she reached up and turned one of the bundles, tilting her head to see the underside of the leaves. She caught Tobias watching and put her hand down. "Shepherd's crown," Tobias said. "My wife dried them every autumn. I stocked after she—" He paused. "I kept the bundles up." Riska looked at the bundle a moment longer. "It's past its use," she said. "Not unkind. Just accurate." "The oils are gone. It won't do anything now." "I know," Tobias said. She looked at him then, just for a second, with something in her expression that wasn't pity and wasn't sympathy. Something quieter than either of those. She looked away. Hassa finished her porridge and stood up. She carried her bowl to the basin without being asked. set it down with a small, precise click. She went to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Without turning around, "The roof will hold now." She said it flat, like a report, like she was noting that the grain was cut. Then she went out. Tobias sat at the table alone with the fire and the 2 empty bowls and the old herbs on the beam that didn't do anything anymore. He sat there a little while before he got up. Some repairs are just repairs, and some of them are the only language a person has left for what they mean. The second day started before the sun did. Tobias came out to find Hassa already in the field. She'd taken her sickle from where it leaned against the boundary stone and gone in at the far row without waiting for him or for breakfast. He stood on the porch a moment, watching her work in the gray pre-light. That same measured stroke, that same economy. He went back inside and made extra porridge and left a covered bowl on the table for when she came in. Riska was at the well, drawing water. She had her loose hair tied back with a strip of cloth this morning. Practical, not decorative. She filled 2 pails and carried them toward the field, one in each hand, without spilling. Tobias took his own sickle and followed her in. The morning work was quiet and steady. The remaining sections were the awkward ones. The field's edge, where the terrain went slightly uneven, where the grain grew at odd angles and you had to adjust your stroke to compensate. Riska moved through it without slowing, reading each cluster before she cut it. Tobias worked beside her for a stretch and watched her method without being obvious about it. She didn't fight the angle. She went with the lean of the grain and let the blade do the work. It was the better technique, and he'd been doing it the harder way for years. By midday, they'd covered ground that would have taken Tobias a full week alone. He did the count, standing at the field's edge with a cup of water, looking at the finished rows, and the number sat in him strangely. Not uncomfortable, just large. The kind of number that makes you recalculate something you thought was fixed. He sat on the boundary stone. Riska sat a few feet away, not close, but not keeping a pointed distance either. She'd rolled the sleeves of her linen shirt up, and there was chaff in her loose hair at the temples where the cloth tie hadn't caught everything. She was looking at the soil at the field's edge, the place where the cultivated ground met the rough grass of the boundary. She reached down and picked up a handful, turned it in her fingers. "This edge hasn't been turned in a few seasons," she said. "No," Tobias said. "Too much ground for one man." She let the soil fall. "The drainage is pulling east. If you leave it another year, the compaction will work back into the main field." She said it without looking at him, just looking at the soil, matter of fact, as though she were reading something written there. "You'd lose maybe a quarter of your yield on the west side." Tobias looked at the boundary edge. He hadn't thought about it in those terms. He'd thought about it as neglect, as one more thing he hadn't gotten to. She was describing a process, a sequence of cause and effect that was already in motion. "How do you know that?" he said. She looked up then. "I managed the clan gardens for 4 years. 40 plots, different soil in each one." "You learned to read it." She said it simply, without pride and without deflection. 4 years, 40 plots, a matter of record. Tobias nodded. He looked at the boundary edge with different eyes now. Hassa came out of the far section and moved to the next without stopping, her stroke unchanged from the morning. She was within earshot, and she knew it. She'd positioned herself that way. Tobias had started to notice. Never so close as to be part of the conversation, always within range of it. She worked with her head down and gave no sign of listening, but her shoulders were angled slightly toward them, and her pace never quite drowned out the words. He was going to say something else about the soil when he heard the horse. A single rider coming up the track from the south. Tobias knew the horse before he could see the rider, a dun mare with a white sock on the left front leg, the particular clip of her hooves on the packed dirt. He stood up. Dork Heron pulled up at the field's edge and sat in the saddle and looked at the field. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a gray beard he kept neat. A good neighbor on the whole. He'd helped Tobias get in the hay 2 summers ago, and Tobias had done the same for him the summer before that. He had a way of looking at things before he spoke that was either careful thinking or careful choosing. He looked at the field for a long time. He looked at Riska, sitting on the boundary stone with chaff in her hair and soil in her fingers. He looked at Hassa, working the far row with a sickle. He looked at the cut sections, the stacked sheaves, the quantity of finished work. Then he looked at Tobias. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He took off his hat, turned it in his hands once, put it back on. "Didn't know you'd taken on hands," he said. His voice was careful. "Few days ago," Tobias said. Dork looked at the field again. Riska had stood up and moved a few steps away, not retreating, just giving the men room to talk in the way that was practical rather than deferential. Hassa had not stopped working. She didn't look up. But her stroke had slowed by exactly the amount that let her hear everything clearly. Dork cleared his throat. "Going well, it looks like," he said. "Very well," Tobias said. Dork looked at him then, and there was something behind his eyes that hadn't moved into his voice yet. He was turning something over. He turned the hat brim in his fingers again. He'd put it back on, but he was touching the brim, a habit Tobias recognized from years of watching the man think at grain markets and fence disputes. "I'll let you get back to it," Dork said finally. He gathered his reins. He looked at Hassa's back one more time, at the axe at her hip, at the tattoos on her forearm, at the plates with their bone pins, at the sickle moving through his neighbor's grain. Something settled into his expression, some decision or some postponement of a decision. He turned the horse and rode back down the track. Tobias watched him go. Riska was watching too, from the boundary stone, her dark amber eyes on the rider until he rounded the hillside and disappeared. Hassa's sickle moved through another stroke, and another, and she said nothing at all. But her stroke had gone precise in a way that was slightly different from efficiency. The way a person moves when they're concentrating on the work so they don't have to think about what they just heard someone decide about them. A man on a horse doesn't have to say anything. The way he rides away says it for him. Dork came back the next morning. This time he didn't come on the horse. He came on foot, which meant he'd left the mare at the track's edge and walked up deliberately, which meant he'd thought about how he wanted to arrive. He was wearing his good belt. Tobias noticed that. Not work clothes. Dork Heron in his good belt on a Tuesday morning meant he'd decided something overnight and come to deliver it. Tobias was at the porch with his first cup of water when he saw him coming up the track. He waited. Dork stopped at the yard's edge. He looked at the barn, at the field, at the house. He looked at everything except Tobias for a moment. Then he looked at Tobias. "The village is going to be displeased," he said. He said it the way you deliver information you didn't choose to carry. Flat, with the weight of it left to the receiver. Tobias held his cup. "I appreciate the warning," he said. Dork looked at him. There was something in his face that might have been an argument, and might have been concern, and might have been both wearing the same coat. He waited for more. When nothing came, he said, "It's not just talk, Tobias. There are people who'll push this further." "Thank you for telling me," Tobias said. Dork stood there another moment. He was a man who'd known Tobias for 15 years, since before the farm had felt too large for one man, since before the house had gone quiet. He knew when a conversation was over. He gave a short nod and walked back down the track the way he'd come, without looking at the field. Tobias went inside and set his cup down. Then he picked up his sickle and went out to the field. Hassa was already working the north section. She'd heard everything. Her back was to the house, and she was facing the grain. and she didn't turn when he came out. But the quality of her stillness had changed. There was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. A held quality, like a person who's made a calculation and is waiting for the number to settle. Riska was at the far end, binding. She looked up when Tobias passed, but didn't ask anything. Hasse turned when he reached the north section. She looked at him directly. Those golden-brown eyes, sharp and with nothing hidden in them now. She said, "We'll leave." Tobias looked at the field. The north section, the south corner, the strip along the hill, all of it still standing. He looked at it the same way he'd looked at it 11 days ago, before any of this, when it had just been the weight of too much work and too little time, and no one to help carry it. "The field isn't finished," he said. "Leave when it's done." Hasse looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes and then went still. She turned back to the grain and brought the sickle through a clean stroke. He went to his own row. They worked through the morning in that particular silence. Not the productive silence of the first days, but something with more pressure in it. The air was still hot. The dry wheat smell was thicker up in the north section, where the grain had stood longest. Tobias worked, and felt Dork's words sitting in his chest the way a swallowed thing sits. Not comfortable, just there. Around mid-morning he went back to the house for water. He filled 2 pails at the well and came around the side of the house and stopped. The garden bed was along the south wall, Magda's kitchen garden, the long rectangular plot that ran from the corner of the house to the old fence post. He hadn't touched it in 3 years. The herbs had gone to seed, the useful ones smothered by thistles and couch grass. The whole bed a tangle of things that had once been intentional and weren't anymore. He'd walked past it every day for 3 years, and looked at it, and walked past it. Riska was kneeling at the far end of it. She had a short-handled tool he didn't recognize. She must have found it in the barn, something Magda had used that he'd forgotten existed. She was working it under the root mat of the thistles and lifting them clear, shaking the soil back into the bed. She worked with the same focused quiet she brought to everything, moving along the row, pulling the dead weight clear and setting it to the side. She hadn't asked. She hadn't mentioned it. She'd just seen it and started. Tobias stood at the corner of the house with 2 pails of water and watched her. She didn't know he was there. She worked away along the bed, clearing section by section, and where the thistle came clear he could see the dark soil underneath. Good soil, turned and deep. Magda's soil that had been waiting under the neglect. Riska found something at the center of the bed, a plant that had survived. Some stubborn perennial that had made it through 3 years without tending, and she worked around it with more care, leaving it clear of the debris. Tobias set the pails down quietly. He turned and walked back around the front of the house before she looked up. He stood at the front wall for a moment with his back against the boards, looking out at the hill. The sky was the same color it always was. The field made its dry sounds. Somewhere behind the house a woman was kneeling in the dirt, pulling thistles from a garden she had no reason to care about, on a farm she was leaving in a few days. And she hadn't said a word about it to anyone. He stood there until the feeling settled into something he could carry. Then he picked up his sickle and went back to the field. Some things you don't look at directly. Not because they're not real. Because they're more real than you're ready for, and you need a moment first. This is a good place to pause and ask, has something like this ever happened to you? When a stranger did something small and unrequested that landed heavier than it had any right to? If this story is finding something in you, leave a like or subscribe. It helps more people find their way here, and there are more stories like this one waiting. They came from the village mid-morning, 2 days later. 2 men on foot, which was how the village sent people when it wanted to appear neighborly rather than official. Tobias saw them from the field, knew them both. Fen Aldrich, who ran the grain store and sat on the community council, and a younger man named Bress, who went wherever Fen Aldrich went and carried his silences for him. They walked up the track at a pace that wasn't hurried and wasn't leisurely, the pace of men who'd agreed on their purpose before they left. Tobias met them on the porch. He didn't invite them inside. "Just checking everything's all right out here," Fen said. He had a broad, weathered face and a way of smiling that involved only the lower half of it. He looked past Tobias at the yard, at the barn, at the field where Hasse and Riska were working the south corner. Hasse had her back to the house. Her axe was at her hip, and her sickle was moving through the grain at its usual pace. Riska was binding, further out. Neither of them looked up. "Everything's fine," Tobias said. "Good, good." Fen looked at the field a moment longer. Bress stood slightly behind him and said nothing, which was what Bress was there for. "It's just that there's been some concern. People talking." Fen turned his smile back to Tobias. "You know how it is." "I do," Tobias said. "They're working the harvest for you, then? These—" Fen paused for exactly the length of time it takes to choose a word. "These workers of yours." "They are," Tobias said. He kept his voice the same temperature it had been since they arrived. Not warm, not cold. The temperature of a man standing on his own porch, discussing his own land. Fen nodded slowly. He looked at the field again. Hasse had not altered her stroke by a single degree. She worked with the sickle moving through the dry grain and the cut rows falling behind her, and she might have been the only person for a mile in any direction for all she showed of knowing they were there. But she was positioned at the south corner, which was the closest point of the field to the porch, and Tobias had started to understand how Hasse chose her positions. "The community just wants to know there's no trouble," Fen said. "That everyone's comfortable with the situation." "I'm comfortable," Tobias said. "Thank you for asking." Fen looked at him with the lower half of his smile fading out. He turned the brim of his hat in his fingers, the same gesture as Dork, the village habit of handling something when you'd rather be handling the conversation differently. "Right," he said after a moment. "Right, then. You know where we are if you need anything." "I do," Tobias said. They walked back down the track. Tobias watched them until they rounded the hill, then went inside and drank a full cup of water standing at the counter. He set the cup down and looked at the window. The field, the south corner, Hasse's back, moving through the grain. He went back out. Riska came to him at the field's edge 20 minutes later with the water pail and a ladle. She offered it without a word, and he drank and handed it back. She looked at him. Not studying him, just looking, the way she looked at the soil, taking a reading. Whatever she found, she kept it. She went back to her binding. The afternoon was long and hot, and they finished the south corner. By the time the light started going orange, the stack count was further along than Tobias had planned for, which was becoming a pattern he'd stopped being surprised by. After supper, he went out to smoke on the front step. He hadn't smoked much since Magda died. She disliked it, and he'd cut back for her, and then afterward it hadn't seemed worth the effort to start again. He still kept a pipe and a small pouch in his jacket pocket, a habit he hadn't broken. Tonight, he wanted it. He sat on the step and packed the pipe and lit it and let the smoke go. The night was cool, the sky clear and full. He could hear the chicken settling in the coop and the horse moving in the paddock, the sounds the farm made when it was done with the day. He heard the barn door, footsteps on the packed dirt. Not Riska's. Riska moved lightly. These were deliberate steps, the measured tread of someone who'd decided to come out but wasn't going to announce it. Hasse came around the barn corner and stopped when she saw him. She looked at the pipe. She looked at the step. She looked at the darkness past the field. She sat down on the far end of the step, not close, a full arm's length between them. She sat with her elbows on her knees and her hands loose between them, and looked out at the same darkness he was looking at. The small axe sat at her hip, and the bone pins in her plates caught the faint starlight. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. He smoked his pipe, and she sat with her hands loose, and the night went on around them. After a while, the silence changed. It was the same silence, but it had settled into something different. The way a room changes temperature when a fire's been going long enough. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It wasn't uncomfortable either. It was just two people sitting in the dark on the same step with the same field in front of them and the same cool air coming down off the hill. Tobias finished his pipe. He knocked it out against the step and put it back in his pocket. He looked out at the field, the stacked sheaves standing in rows, the finished sections and the sections still to do, the dark line of the tree line beyond. His farm. Still his farm. He stood up. He said, "Early start tomorrow." He went inside. Hassa sat on the step a while longer. He heard her there, through the wall, the weight of her against the boards. Then, eventually, the footsteps back to the barn. Then, nothing but the night. There is a kind of silence that two people make together that neither of them could make alone. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need explaining. You just know, after, that something was different about it. The photograph had been on the shelf above the fireplace for 3 years. Tobias had moved it once, put it face down during the first winter, couldn't say why, then put it back up in spring and felt better for doing it. It was a small thing in a plain frame, slightly tilted because the shelf had a bow in it that he'd never corrected. Magda at 30, sitting on the boundary stone at the east field, squinting into the sun. She hadn't known he was going to take it. That was why it was a good photograph. She was looking at something in the middle distance, and her hands were in her lap, and she was just herself, caught in an ordinary moment that turned out to matter. Riska had been looking at it since the second day. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, patient, unhurried, like she had all the time the looking required. This morning she was at the basin washing her hands after the morning work, and she looked at it again, and this time she asked. "Your wife," she said, not a question. "Yes," Tobias said. He was at the table with a mug. Riska dried her hands on the cloth by the basin. She looked at the photograph another moment. "When did she die?" 3 years ago, Tobias said. "Fever." It came fast. Riska turned and sat down across from him. She put her hands on the table, the same way she always sat, grounded, present, not performing comfort. "What was her name?" she said. "Magda." She nodded. She looked at her hands. "We lost our mother 4 years ago," she said. "Not fever." The clan was moving. It was winter, and the march was too long for her. She said it the same way she said everything, plainly, the facts given their weight and no more. Hassa carried her the last 2 days. Tobias looked at his mug. He thought about that. The weight of it. The literal weight. The length of 2 days of winter march. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that fit. "She doesn't talk about it," Riska said. "She works instead." A small pause. "You know how that is, I think." Tobias looked up. Riska was watching him with those dark, amber eyes that missed less than most people's eyes did. He looked back at his mug. "Yes," he said. "I know how that is." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Hassa was in the field. She'd gone in after breakfast the way she always did, because the work was there, and the work was what she had. The sickle sounds came through the open window, steady and distant. "She was good at the land," Tobias said. He meant Magda. He wasn't sure why he was saying it, except that it felt true, and the truth wanted somewhere to go. Better than me. She knew what the soil needed before I did. She grew things I wouldn't have known to try." He paused. "The garden beds along the south wall, those were hers." Riska said nothing. She looked at her hands again. "I let them go," Tobias said. "After." "I know," Riska said. "I saw them." "I know you saw them," Tobias said. Another pause, not uncomfortable. The kind that means both people know what isn't being said and have decided it doesn't need saying. Then the letter arrived. He heard the writer before he saw him, a post rider from the village, young, who came out this far only when there was something official. He handed the envelope to Tobias at the door, without making eye contact, and rode back down the track at a pace that suggested he didn't want to be there longer than necessary. Tobias stood in the doorway and opened it. The language was formal and dry, the way official language always was, designed to sound neutral while delivering something that was not neutral at all. A complaint had been filed with the district office regarding the unlicensed residence of non-human persons on registered farmland within the village boundary. The matter was under review. The landowner was required to confirm the residential status of any non-human persons on the property within 7 days, or face a formal inquiry. He read it twice. He folded it along its original lines and put it in his breast pocket. Riska was standing at the window. She'd heard the rider arrive. She was looking out at the track, and when Tobias came back to the table, she looked at him. And then she looked at his breast pocket, where the letter was. And she looked back at her hands. "Official," she said. "Yes," Tobias said. She nodded slowly. She turned the information over the way she turned soil over, checking what was underneath it. Then she got up and went out to the field without another word. He heard her say something to Hassa, low and short. Hassa's sickle stopped. A silence. Then the sickle started again. That evening, Hassa said to Riska, quiet, but not quietly enough that Tobias couldn't hear through the open barn wall where he was checking the horse's shoes. "Don't get attached." Riska didn't answer. The silence she gave back was not agreement. It was something else. A person making a decision they're not ready to announce yet. Tobias straightened up and moved away from the barn wall and didn't hear the rest of it, or what came after, or whether anything did. Some warnings come too late. Not because the person didn't hear them, because they already knew and chose anyway. Tobias saddled the horse before dawn. He worked quietly, not lighting the barn lamp, letting his hands find the buckles in the dark the way hands do after 16 years of the same task in the same order. Blanket, saddle, girth, 2 fingers under the strap to check the fit. He bridled her and led her out into the yard and stood a moment. The sky was the color of ash at the edge and black still at the center. The field was a dark shape. The barn was quiet. He'd heard Hassa on the other side of the barn wall when he came in. He'd heard her stop moving. She knew what the horse being saddled before dawn meant, even if she didn't know the specifics. He'd decided not to go in and explain it, and he'd spent 10 minutes with the bridle wondering if that was the right call. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted. The barn door opened. Hassa came out and stood in the yard with her arms at her sides. She was fully dressed, axe at her hip, plates pinned. She'd been up. She looked at him on the horse and she said, "I'll come." "No," Tobias said. Her jaw tightened. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. The face of a person who has kept themselves safe through their own competence for a very long time, and finds it difficult to step back from a problem. "It concerns us," she said. "It does," he said. "That's why you should stay." He gathered the reins. "If you come in, they'll spend the whole time looking at you instead of listening to me. You know that." She looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked at the track leading south toward the village, the direction she couldn't go, at least not for this. Her hand moved to the axe at her hip, not reaching for it, just touching the handle the way people touch familiar things when they're working through something difficult. 7 horizontal lines on her forearm. A woman who'd fought her way through everything that had come at her for 24 years. And now the thing coming at her required her to stand in a yard and wait. "I'll be back before midday," Tobias said. He rode out. The track south was empty and cool, the hills dark against the lightening sky. The horse moved at a steady pace, and Tobias let her set it. He had the letter in his breast pocket, and a version of what he wanted to say arranged in his head. And he knew from experience that the version in your head and the conversation you actually have are 2 different things. So he stopped rehearsing it after the first hill and just rode. Behind him, the farm was waking up. He didn't see it, but he knew it, the way you know a place you've lived for 16 years. Riska would be at the well first. She was always first. She'd draw water, she'd go into the field, she'd pick up the work at whatever point the previous day had left it. Hassa would be in the field too, because standing still was not something Hassa did when there was an alternative. They'd work. That was what they did with difficulty. They worked through it, at it, alongside it. The field was almost done. He'd counted it last night. 2 more days, maybe 3 if the weather turned. The harvest that had felt impossible 11 days ago. The harvest he'd been looking at from the window in the dark before dawn with a rifle in his hands was almost in. He held that thought on the ride south, the way you hold something solid when the ground is uncertain. The village council met in the grain store. Fan Aldrich was there, and 2 other men, and a woman named Dara, who kept the district records and had the kind of face that gave nothing before it had to. Tobias sat across from them at the long table and put the letter on the table between them and said what he'd come to say. He said it plainly. They were hired hands. They'd worked the harvest. They were leaving when the work was done. He said the word hired carefully, because the document used the word residential, and hired was a different word. He let the difference sit on the table next to the letter. Fen talked. Dara made notes. The 2 other men looked at the table. There was a conversation about licensing and about precedent and about the feelings of the community, and Tobias listened to all of it and gave it the weight it deserved, which was not nothing, but was also not everything. He rode back before noon. The sun was overhead, and the field was loud with the dry sound of cut grain and the quieter sound of binding. He could see both of them before he'd unsaddled, Riska at the near section, Hassa at the far end, the rows behind them longer than when he'd left. He put the horse up and went inside and stood at the counter. He didn't go out immediately. He needed a moment with what he'd been told in that room. Not the words exactly, but the shape of the thing underneath the words. The part that didn't make it into official language. He stood at the counter until the moment passed into something he could set down. Then he went to the door. Hassa was coming in from the far end of the field. She'd seen him arrive. She'd been watching the track since before he rounded the hill. He was certain of that. She walked toward the house with a sickle in her hand, and she stopped at the yard's edge, 10 feet from him. She looked at his face. She didn't ask anything. She waited. He looked back at her. He thought about what to say, and found that the simple version was the only one that fit. "Go wash up," he said. "I'll put supper on." She stood there a moment. She looked at him with those sharp eyes that read everything and gave back only what she chose to give. Then she looked past him at the house, at the door, the window, the porch step where they'd sat 2 nights ago in a silence that had no name. She turned and walked to the well. Tobias went inside. He put the pot on. He got out the bread and the dried beans and the end of the salt pork, and he made supper the way he made everything, without fuss, without ceremony. Outside, he could hear the well bucket dropping, Haas's hands on the rope, the water coming up. Some things you carry home from a hard conversation and put down in a kitchen without explaining them. And the people who need to know, know. And the people who don't, eat their supper. He told them at supper. He waited until the bowls were down and the bread was broken, and they were all three sitting with the meal in front of them. He didn't see the point in making them wait through eating for bad news. He'd been on the receiving end of that once, a doctor in the village who'd let him and Magda finish their tea before he said what he had to say. And the tea had tasted like nothing, and the waiting had been worse than the words. "The village requires you to leave," he said. 3 days. Haase set down her spoon. She looked at the table, not at him, at the table, at the grain of the wood. Her jaw was set. Then she looked up. "Understood," she said. "We'll go." Tobias picked up his bread. He broke a piece off. He set it down. "I didn't say I wanted you to leave," he said. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something lands in them that changes the shape of the air. Riska had her hands around her bowl, and she was very still. Haase looked at him across the table. Really looked. The way she rarely did, with nothing managed about it. Her golden brown eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Not softness, exactly. More like the absence of the guard she kept in front of everything else. She looked at him for a long time. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Tobias had never seen her not know what to say. It lasted only a moment. She found her footing again, set her expression back into something more like her usual face. But the moment had been there, and both of them knew it. 3 days, she said finally. The field will be done. Yes, Tobias said. They ate. Riska looked at her bowl and ate without speaking. Haase ate with her eyes on the middle distance, the place she looked when she was thinking through something she wasn't going to say out loud. Outside the window, the evening light was going gold on the hill. The chickens made their settling sounds. The farm did what farms do at the end of a day. After supper, Haase went to the barn. Tobias cleaned the bowls, and Riska sat at the table. She had been quieter than usual all day, since the letter, since the morning Haase had said, "Don't get attached," and she hadn't answered. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the bundles of herbs on the ceiling beam, the ones she'd said were past their use, the ones Tobias had kept anyway. He set the last bowl on the shelf and turned around. Riska was already at the door. She'd taken her skirt hem in one hand, and she had something in the other. A small cloth bundle he hadn't seen her carry in at supper, tied at the neck with a strip of leather. She looked at him once. Then she went out. He followed her to the doorway and watched. She went to the south garden bed, the one she'd cleared of thistles, the one she'd worked along on her knees without asking. She crouched at the far end, the end she'd cleared last, where the soil was darkest and deepest. She untied the cloth bundle. Inside were seeds, small, dark, irregular in shape. Not any seed Tobias recognized. She pressed them in with her thumb, one at a time, spacing them with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was planting and what it needed. 4 seeds, 5, 6. She pressed each one to a particular depth. He could see her measuring it by feel, adjusting her thumb. Then she smoothed the soil over them and sat back on her heels. Tobias came out onto the porch. "What is that?" he said. Riska looked up at him over her shoulder. "Orc seeds," she said. She used the words plainly, the way you name a thing by what it is. "From the clan gardens. I carried them when we left." She looked back at the bed. "They'll come up in spring. Broad leaves, red stems. The root is good for fever." She paused. "You'll need to keep the bed clear around them through winter, or they won't establish." Tobias looked at the smooth patch of soil, at the 6 small places where her thumb had pressed. "What do they taste like?" he said. He wasn't sure why he asked that. It was just the question that came. Riska considered it. "Bitter," she said. "But the bitterness goes if you cook them with something sweet." She stood up and brushed the soil from her skirt. Magda would have known what to pair them with, I think. She knew her herbs. Tobias looked at the garden bed, at the dark soil, at the place where something was planted that wouldn't come up until he was here alone again in spring, that would push through the cold soil and put out broad leaves and red stems in a garden a woman with dark red hair had weeded on her knees without being asked. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You'll see," Riska said. She went back inside. He stood on the porch, alone in the cooling evening with the garden bed in front of him. The soil was dark where she'd pressed the seeds in. Nothing to see yet. Nothing to show for it but the smoothed earth and the knowledge of what was underneath. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the repaired roof corner that morning after the rain. Standing still and looking at something a person had done for him without making it into a moment. He went inside. He got the lamp. He sat at the table and didn't read and didn't do anything in particular. He just sat in his kitchen, in his house, on his farm, and listened to it be less quiet than it had been 11 days ago, before 2 women had come out of the tree line at dawn and stood in his grain. 3 days, the field would be done. Some things get planted in ground that won't remember who planted them. That's not loss. That's just how seeds work. They don't need credit. They just need the right soil and the patience of a winter, and someone who'll be there when spring comes. They were at the gate when the guards arrived. 2 men from the district office, not village men, strangers with the look of people who go where the paperwork sends them and don't take it personally. They came up the track on horses and pulled up at the yard's edge and looked at Hassa and Riska standing there with their packs. The packs were small. Everything they owned fit into what they could carry, which told you something about the last few years without anyone having to say it. Hassa had her axe at her hip and her sickle tied across the pack, the blade wrapped in cloth. She'd cleaned it before she returned it to the barn wall, and then she'd taken it back down and wrapped it and packed it, and Tobias had seen her do it and hadn't said anything. The taller guard looked at the packs. He looked at Tobias, standing beside them on the porch step. "They're leaving?" he said. "Yes," Tobias said. "I'm seeing them off." The guard looked at this for a moment, the 3 of them, the packs, the finished field behind the house with its rows of stacked sheaves standing in the morning light. He looked at the barn with its repaired corner. He looked at the garden bed along the south wall with its smoothed earth. He nodded once, turned his horse, and waited at the track's edge. Tobias came down off the step. They walked out together, him and Hassa and Riska, across the yard and through the gate and down the track, the guards riding slowly ahead of them at a distance that was official without being aggressive. The morning was cool. The light came flat and clean off the hill. Tobias walked with his hands at his sides and didn't fill the silence with anything. At the boundary of his land, the old stone marker at the track's edge, the one that had been there since before he'd bought the farm, worn smooth and listing slightly south, Hassa stopped. She turned. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him across the supper table, when he'd said, "I didn't say I wanted you to leave." With nothing managed about it, nothing kept behind her eyes. Just her face, plain and open, which on Hassa was rarer than anything else she'd given him in 11 days. She looked at the farm over his shoulder, the house, the barn, the field, the garden bed he'd have to keep clear through winter so the seeds would establish. She looked at all of it the way you look at a place you're filing away. Then she looked at him. "The harvest is good," she said. 2 words short of a full sentence. No flourish, no weight added. Just the fact, stated plainly, the way she stated everything. Tobias held it. "It is," he said. She held his gaze another moment. Then she turned and walked past the boundary stone and down the track. Riska followed. She didn't look back, but she put her hand out as she passed the stone and let her fingers trail across it, just for a second, the way you touch something you're leaving. The copper bands in her hair caught the light. The guards fell in alongside them. The track curved south and they went around the hill and were gone. Tobias stood at the boundary marker. He stood there for a while. The farm was behind him, and the empty track was in front of him, and the morning went on being a morning. The light moving, the hill's shadow shortening, a bird somewhere in the tree line making its one repeated sound. He looked at the place where they'd gone around the hill. He looked at it until it was just a track again. He turned back. He walked through the gate and across the yard, past the barn with its repaired corner, past the well. He stopped at the garden bed along the south wall. The soil was dark where Riska had pressed the seeds in, darker than the soil around it, still holding the moisture from her hands, or maybe just looking that way in the morning light. He couldn't have said which. 6 small places, smoothed over, nothing showing, nothing to see yet but the earth itself and the knowledge of what was underneath it. He crouched down. He pressed his palm flat against the soil, not digging, not disturbing anything, just his hand against the surface, feeling the cool of it, the slight give. The soil that had been Magda's and was still his, and had in it now something that would push up red-stemmed and broad-leafed in spring, something bitter that went sweet if you cooked it right, something a woman had carried in a cloth bundle across however many miles of hard road and pressed in with her thumb before she left. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he stood up. He brushed the soil from his palm. He went inside. The kitchen was quiet. 3 bowls on the shelf where he'd stacked them this morning. The table with its 6 chairs. The photograph on the shelf above the fireplace. Magda on the boundary stone, looking at something in the middle distance. The herbs on the ceiling beam, past their use, kept anyway. The fire down to coals. He put a log on. He put the kettle over it. He sat down at the table and waited for the water to boil. Outside the field stood Dawn, the sheaves in their rows, the grain in. Someone else's harvest, finished.